in order to inspire them and raise their interest in the project, challenging followers to take greater ownership for their work, and understanding the strengths and the weaknesses of followers, and allowing the leader in so doing to align followers with tasks that enhance their performance. And while senior staff at the MRC remember this role model as an outstanding science leader, they also fondly recall that he used to come to the canteen to eat with them. And they especially recall his humility in getting the MRC driver to finally teach him to drive, in yet another triumph for transformation. I don't think the MRC had a president who couldn't drive before. And so this was a great triumph. So in a nutshell, transformation of the MRC in the Makgoba years has been described, and I quote, as an integral part of the national transformation of our society, executed through, and I quote again, the continuous change and adaptation of the MRC's intrinsic values and processes to its external environment, with its research agenda guided by a culture of human rights as a vital component of the strategy of transformation. Russell, I know you said we shouldn't be praise singers, but, and maybe I'm sounding like that, but I do think that Melegapuru's term at the MRC was phenomenal, and the country and its science communities thank you for that.
As Marion mentioned, I inherited guns as part of my legacy. And being interested in transformation, I thought it might be the quickest way to get people, just shoot them up and the organization is transformed. But that was the culture of the MRC when we inherited it. It had this preoccupation with security and guns. And I assisted in removing them from being part of the job description of the president of the MRC. The second era we faced at the MRC was to ask the MRC to go to the TRC and make a presentation there and obviously either apologize or give up the truth as to what they did as a health protector of the nation, and when we believe that they didn't protect the nation. Of course, as you could imagine, there was a big split in the board, people being protectionists and so forth. But I think we stuck our guns, and the MRC remains the only institution in the country that actually went to make a presentation to the TRC to spell out the truth of what happened before 1994. Out of that experience, I actually wrote to the chairperson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. And I asked him that I believe that all universities or institutions of higher learnings should come and present to the TRC, because all of them claim some kinds of achievements that I think if they are interrogated, this may become some form of truth that we understand to assist in the transformation of universities and higher education. Of course, I'm told that this was debated at the TRC's highest level, and they got frightened to take on universities. So people got frightened, and all I received was a courteous letter that we've received your note and we are considering it. And you know, when you get a response like that, it means you are getting nothing out of that. The third point I want to comment on is the interferences of government in running our institutions. This is not done obvious because the universities are autonomous. It's done behind the scenes. And I'll give you 4 examples. When I was going to intending to apply for the presidency of the MRC, I received a visit from one of the president's advisors to come and ask me not to apply for the job because they had someone in mind who shall remain nameless. However, I stated it that this is a job that must be competed for. I'll put my name. If they don't want me, that's fine. But I'm not going to sort of be cowed into it by the fact that they came from the president's office. Of course, then came another one of people who, of course, had been scientists that the government of the day felt that they should come into the MRC, and they felt that they could do this by either phoning the president to say, we've got a friend from Tanzania or somebody from Zambia that he does during the struggle, and therefore you must give him a job at the MRC, as part of the Payback Syndrome. Of course, I said, yes, I think they can be employed at the MRC, but there is a process at the MRC. You apply, your peers review you, and if they think you are good enough, you'll get the job, and so forth. So I cannot just sort of dish out jobs. And of course, I think one of these people came, and his peers thought he was not suitable, and he went back. He came from Tanzania, as a matter of fact. And we had a liberation school in that country, so I don't know whether that was a payback or not. So the idea, when this whole HIV issue came about, there had been this sort of examples of interferences behind the scenes that had taken place. And I remember this phone call about HIV/AIDS when the then president asked me, to stand with him publicly to almost say that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. This was a phone call in the middle of the night. And I said to him, but where would I have got that from? I mean, I can understand you read your science from the internet. I don't do that. I actually practice science. So how would I say that in front of my peers? He says, no, this can be done, and it will send a very powerful message. So I said to him, there was a man called Stalin in the Soviet Union, and he had a scientist called Lysenko. And Lysenko had this theory that if you wanted milk, just go and find a cow in the fields, and you start pulling its teats, and the longer you pull it, the milk will come out. It's called adaptive science. You can adapt anything. Of course, this is the man who actually destroyed biological sciences in the Soviet Union, because anything that was seen as chromosomes under a microscope was regarded as an artifact. So people in the Soviet Union who trained there never read biology because it was an artifact as a science under scientists. Unfortunately, he was Stalin's scientist, and he fell into disgrace, but Stalin remained the president, and he fell in disgrace. So I said to Mbeki then, the day I fall into disgrace, you will fire me, you will remain the president. I didn't realize that actually it would be the other way around. But at the time, it just happens to be like that. But I think the most important thing that I want to share with you was that as part of the reorganization of the MRC, the one thing that I learned that I often also carried into this institution was actually clustering the programs of the MRC into 5 major programs that had critical mass in them, that drove science, and that were internationally respected, and were led by the best scientists in the country. And of course, you can say, what has that to do with UKZN? As you know, when we started the measure here, we had 112 departments. They are now clustered into 20 schools. So I had learned from the lessons of that clustering that it actually does work and produce efficient systems. So the lessons that you learn from somewhere else, completely different, can be nuanced and applied to another system where it is working. It never works perfectly when you translate it or you transcribe it as it is, but it requires to be nuanced like in any other system to suit the mission of the organization. So here we are, I think, at UKZN. We are maybe the only institution in the country that has clustered ourselves. We call this colleges, and this is the trend in higher education today. We are struggling with it here and there, but nevertheless, it has got some positive spin-offs. And I think when it's fully functional and everybody understands it, it will be one of the things that will drive the system even much better. I know that UNISA is trying to go into that structure too. I also have been speaking to Cheryl Delaray. They want to go into that structure because it's impossible to run a university of over 30,000 students with the central old model of a university. And if you look at the trend in the UK and in many parts of the world, everyone is running away from that old central model into a small business unit. Whether you call them faculties or you call them colleges, it's just the name, but actually it is to consolidate, have critical mass, be able to do big projects that are becoming part of the trend, both in science and in other ways. And I think we have started that trend here. And as I say, it's not perfect yet, but I think every time we review it, there is some improvements and we learn some lessons. And I think Albert can tell you lots of stories now that we've been visiting schools as to what's happening in relation to that. But thank you.
I think we're going to have some comments after Rafa. We're running a bit late.
Right, well, it's an enormous pleasure for me to be here and also a privilege, and I would like to say greetings and hello to everyone, and also especially to Professor Makgoba, and indeed to Professor van Jaarsveld, who of course has the mission now of continuing to run University of KwaZulu-Natal. And I see from the program that my brief is to speak to the University of Natal years, which of course one could interpret in many different ways. But before I do that, I want to say a few very personal things. And one of them is very specifically about Professor Makgoba. We established a very good relationship right from the start, and it continues to this very day. And there's something very personal about Professor Makgoba that I'd like to mention, because I think these personal aspects are not unimportant. And that is that he is a wonderfully loyal and supportive and consistent friend. And I've really appreciated greatly over the years the friendship and the communications that we've had with one another. And I just thought I would mention that. What I want to talk to really are two themes. The one is the theme of myth, and I will speak a little bit about that. And the other is the theme of transformation itself. And let me perhaps begin with the theme of transformation very briefly. Transformation, like so many words, is indeed a very promiscuous word, and one can use it in many different ways. And what I found particularly exciting about Professor Makgoba's arrival at the then University of Natal, this is before the merger itself had been effectively even entered into or concluded once he'd been appointed Vice-Chancellor here, was that he signalled a particular kind of transformation that has perhaps not been adverted to as yet this morning. And that is the transformation of what was then the University of Natal and what was to be the University of KwaZulu-Natal into a modern, globalized institution. What he brought, and I found this extremely attractive, was a modernizing globalist vision that he helped And of course, these tendencies and trends had been in place already, but he really effectively forced the then University of Natal and what was to become the University of KwaZulu-Natal out of the provincialisms that had come over the years to characterize these institutions. And I think this was an extremely important contribution, and one which I believe, and Professor Makgoba might not agree with me here, I think flowed from his very intense involvement in and commitment to the very highest levels of scientific inquiry and practice. I want to say a little bit about the myth aspect. There was a kind of a myth that flowed around that the University of Natal during the years when I was here, beginning in the early 1970s, I arrived as a 23-year-old. I believe I was the second youngest lecturer on the staff. That it was some sort of idyllic, halcyon place. That this was a most wonderful, if you like, sunny seaside U, as somebody once referred to it. It wasn't, in fact, in my experience, at all idyllic. There was certainly a kind of convivial, provincial warmth that you find in small institutions of the kind that this was. But there was an aversion to serious, scholarly, intellectual work of certain kinds. It was, of course, again, big enough to be complex. And there were groupings, there were factions, there were interest agglomerations, as you get in all organizations. There was, of course, an old, dare I say it, white conservative constituency that was terrified, A, of doing any work, and B, of engaging in any kind of real significant change. There was a well-meaning and I believe really in its own private way committed liberal constituency that articulated, I suppose, the public image of the University of Natal as a liberal institution that condemned the 1959 Extension of University Education Act, but was not really in a particularly strong position to do anything effective about it. And then there was the grouping that I, in my youthful years, was an integral part of, and which Eddie Webster, I know, was also part of when he arrived 2 years after I arrived, what you might call the radical grouping. And there are some people here that I think one should mention because they did play, I think, a very significant role in the old University of Natal. Perhaps not a role that translated into any kind of effective exercise of power, but certainly served as a subterranean force. And the people that come to mind, interesting, were the late Michael Newpon and Richard Turner. And we constituted, I suppose you might call it, the radical grouping, the people who really, I suppose, anticipated the need for a transformed institution, but were as yet in those very dark apartheid years in no position to do much about it, other than in the way in which we practiced teaching in the classroom and the way in which we did in our own way try to do research. But this comes back to the myth. You know, the old University of Natal that I joined as a young man, and I had to join it, I needed a job. I had no money, and I had an ailing mother that I needed to support, and so I took the very first job that came my way, and I was actually brought here by Turner and Newpon because I was seen as one of the, in scare quotes, young lions on the scene, and I came here and suddenly found that what I was expected to be was a kind of general purpose Batman. There was no mentoring, which of course today is a conventional term that we all use in a cliched fashion. There was no what we call now career coursing. One simply got thrown tasks, generally the more or less menial tasks, huge teaching loads, vast amount of marking for those who were in more senior positions who didn't want to do the marking. And to put it bluntly, it wasn't actually an environment in which one could really become a career-oriented academic. So one had to actually make one's career against the current. It was a bit like swimming out in the Indian Ocean here when the current does nasty things and turns you upside down. So what I wanted to do was to, in a sense, challenge that myth that still flops around, I think, now in more geriatric and aged circles, that the old University of Natal was somehow a wonderful, idyllic environment. Of course, that did change in the 1980s and the 1990s. The force of demographic shift in South Africa, the fact that it was clear that the apartheid order was destined to collapse. Something that really was clear to a political scientist as far back as the late 1970s, mid-1970s. By the 1980s, it was absolutely clear that apartheid was crumbling. And slowly, of course, the demography of the institution changed, and people increasingly began to take note of this. So a lot of innovations as well. And I think one also has to look at the upside as well as the downside. One of the things I like to do always is to look at both. The downside is that it was, and you can see this in the research profile, it was let me be blunt, it was a lazy institution. And the laziness of the institution didn't fit my, dare I say it, Johannesburg cosmopolitan sensibility. So that was quite irritating. But by the 1980s and the 1990s, this had shifted. The place had become a much more vital and vibrant institution. And when Professor Makgoba came, what I had a sense of, and there was a group of us, myself, Elizabeth Descartes, Ronnie Miller, who said, we can actually work with this Vice-Chancellor. This is really a man with whom we can help, if you like, to make some kind of history. And this is what I'm going to conclude on. That what has come out of this morning's discussion suggests, if I dare say so, that Professor Makgoba would be a wonderful subject for a biography. And what it reminds me of is a famous line from Karl Marx. I know Professor Makgoba is not a Marxist, I'm not a Marxist, but Karl Marx has this wonderful line that men make their own history, but not entirely under circumstances of their own choosing. And I think what one, and this is my concluding comment, in fact I've got two concluding comments. The one is that Professor Makgoba had to take over the huge challenge of presiding over the merger of the University of Natal as it had been, with its two campuses with very different cultures, and the University of Durban-Westville. And he had to do this in a context of political and institutional forces that made it a very difficult task. And the fact that it has been so successful speaks volumes to the skill and the vision, and this I think is the point I want to make, the vision that Professor Makgoba brought to bear to this task. The second point, and I really just want to repeat myself momentarily, is that what he did is that he did this in a way that helped to craft an institutional complex that took its bearings from the very best practices of the very best universities globally. And that's really how Professor Makgoba and I began our discussion. I'd written an article back in 2003, Capstone or Deadweight, with Professors Fediker and Lewis, and what we'd discovered is that the South African universities, including Natal, and not least the historically white universities, had become very indifferent institutions, that they'd actually stagnated. There were bad institutions in the country, and I shan't mention them, but the good universities were no longer as good as once, genuinely, I believe, they had been. And that was an apartheid legacy effect. And so what Professor Makgoba had to deal with in a CEO capacity was the presiding over the transformation of an institution into one that was going to be globally resonant under very difficult circumstances.
Before we begin, we're going to go to the next session. I just want to ask, we've now heard about this University of Natal, the old university. I think we really need some history of this past university. But what I didn't hear about is the blacks. Where were the blacks in this place in the 80s? I want to tell you something. My wife and her sister studied at this university in the early 80s. One at Natal Medical School, the other one at Howard College. Albert, we're going to commission somebody to write the history of this medical school, because they were a group of the most interesting and successful